But today I'm not going to talk about Gaza. I'm going to talk about occupation and apartheid. The mere comparison with apartheid is a very sensitive issue. I appreciate that. I should just mention in this connection that it's a subject that is likely to be raised in the Durban Review Conference in Geneva later this month, or I think it's the middle of April. There's also a study being made of the comparisons by the South African Human Sciences Research Council, and that study group will publish its report on this subject, a fairly lengthy report running to about 300 pages, in London in May and in South Africa in June. So this is a very topical issue, even though it is regarded as offensive in certain quarters. So I will be speaking about occupation and apartheid. Let me begin with the subject of occupation. The Palestinian territory is clearly occupied territory. There's no question about this as far as the international community is concerned in respect of the West Bank. Israel has argued that since 2005, when it withdrew its settlers and its military force from Gaza itself, that it has ceased to be an occupied territory, but the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I think the whole of the international community, with the possible exception of the United States, rejects this argument. They take the view that Gaza is effectively occupied by Israel because Israel has control of its land borders, its sea space and its airspace, and it conducts military incursions fairly regularly into the territory. I think the United States position announced by Condoleezza Rice was that it was a, quote, hostile entity. One doesn't quite know what that means. But one hopes that the Obama administration will make it clear that it regards Gaza and the West Bank as occupied territories. Occupation, military occupation, is a regime that is tolerated by international law. It's not approved. In terms of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which regulates the conduct of the occupying power is obliged to care for the welfare of the occupied people, and in particular to ensure that medical facilities and educational facilities are respected and fostered. But of course we all know that Israel just ignores this obligation, because in Palestine the international donor community is largely responsible for the welfare of the Palestinian people. It's quite clear that international law does not contemplate a lengthy period of occupation, a prolonged occupation, in this case running to over 40 years. The Israeli government tends to take the view that the longer the occupation, the less the obligations, but I think the generally accepted view is that the exact opposite applies. So Israel is in occupation. But over the past 40 years, we've seen the addition of two other elements, that is colonialism and apartheid. And this tends to aggravate the status of the Palestinian territory. I don't think there's any question about colonialism in the Palestinian territory, particularly in the West Bank, since settlers withdrew from Gaza in 2005. We have nearly 500,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, and this number is growing despite promises by successive Israeli governments that they will stop settlements. It's interesting that constructions are taking place in some 88 of the 149 settlements in the West Bank. The growth rate in the settlements is 4.5 compared with 1.5 in Israel itself. And it's important not only to look at settlements, but also at territory in the West Bank that is set aside for military purposes and as nature reserves. And so one can say that roughly 38% of the West Bank is off limits to Palestinians. So there is a form of colonialism in the West Bank, and colonialism is not tolerated by international law. It's clearly unlawful. Not only do settlements constitute a form of colonialism, but they also violate the Geneva Convention. So that's a clear illegality on the part of Israel. The other element that has been introduced is that of apartheid. And it's important to stress that apartheid was not only illegal in South Africa itself, but it's also been declared to be unlawful in international law. In 1973, there was a Convention on Apartheid adopted by the United Nations. And briefly, this convention provides that the infliction on members of a racial group of serious bodily or mental harm, inhuman or degrading treatment, the deliberate creation of conditions preventing the full development of a racial group, and so on, by denying to such a group basic human rights and freedoms, when such acts are committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. So there is a definition, a general definition of apartheid, and this definition has now been transferred to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and the crime of apartheid is seen as a species of crime against humanity. So it's quite clear that apartheid is unlawful under international law. Israel, of course, argues that its policies do not constitute apartheid. It claims that there is no racial discrimination in its practices or policies, and it argues that the purpose of its occupation is simply to maintain law and order pending a peace settlement. It's not to maintain domination of one group over another. I think it's important to stress that there are major differences between apartheid as it was applied in South Africa and the policies and practices in